Welcome. Advanced European Theatre of Operations, Part 2. I think on the last video I was on the brink of getting into the ground combat. I've done a little bit of the strategic warfare with the Graf Spee and some U-boats, and I'd set up to do the attack into Poland. The game has progressed. We're now up to spring 41, so a fair bit of progress really. I suppose an events shortlist would be Poland fell on one turn relatively cheaply, I guess. I think there was a step loss on maybe one of the infantry corps. I think that the Germans lost about sort of 10,000 troops attacking Poland. So, given that that the infantry units represent corps, that's maybe pretty historical. And I think they managed to. I think the Polish Air Force managed to down some Stukas, which, as mentioned before, I'm using the wartime replacement system, so losses to the air are now very keenly felt, because you know you've only got a finite stock of any one particular aircraft type. So in the game, once Poland falls, that immediately triggers Sitzkrieg, which there were no attempts to break Sitzkrieg because the French weren't doing anything fancy, building fortifications in France. So the war in the West began in April 1940, and essentially Vichy was declared, I think, July 40. So just in time to get the better French fighters into play. They get about four free fighters that are comparable to the 109s, but they're insufficient ground forces really to get the full value from them. I debated whether the BF should have hung around for one more turn. They were in Le Havre, and you can trigger Vichy by capturing three French cities, or Paris and two others. And Le Havre was the third one. I was a bit concerned about them being trapped in France and maybe losing them, which, with the benefit of hindsight, if I did it again, I may have hung around a bit longer, because they were well protected by the RAF on the British south coast. So the Germans had lost a fair bit of aircraft at this stage, so they would have been a little bit reluctant to have tangled with the RAF very much, so they wouldn't have been able to get any air superiority. So note to self to possibly a bit braver with the BEF next time. Norway happened late 1940, probably September. I think that was the last guaranteed good weather turn, and that in and of itself is a real puzzle. That's the first time that the game will really test you, because it's the combination of the naval, the air and the land rules, trying to get them to mesh together well. And there's also the added complication of the evasion chits, which you roll for. Essentially the Germans get 2, 3 or 4 evasion chits. I think without them they would struggle to do the historical Norway invasion. That's, I guess, why they were added, and it also added to the confusion. Maybe the British weren't fully expecting it, and you can simulate that uncertainty by adding these evasion chits into the system. So it fell quite easily, but it's a real puzzle. I mean, there's lots of other games that obviously cover this, but nothing makes you plan the invasion of Norway as this one does. Just trying to get the right balance between, you know, what aircraft do I need on what air bases to be able to cover potential counter-attacking moves by the Royal Navy. You need to dissuade them from doing it because you need to make it far too expensive for them to suffer losses. That was good. In North Africa, the Italians able to supply over the Mediterranean, but the problem is there's only really 3 ports: Tripoli, Benghazi and Tobruk, and that actually limits the amount of sea supply chits you can move in, 1 per minor city. You can add a bit of air supply as well, so you're only really able to keep in full supply between sort of 12 and 14 units, and bear in mind that German units count double. So I think I misplayed the Italian hand a bit in Africa. We'll do it differently again, I think, next time. But essentially the British have sort of had a bit of a free rein. They've taken Tobruk and Benghazi, and they're driving Rommel back on Tripoli. And I think in this game the Axis is just going to abandon Africa, probably in sort of mid to late 41. Whether they can go into Tunisia to try and secure some more ports to basically put some more troops, by just throwing good money after bad. So they've started to defend Sicily and build up the fortifications and let the British come to them. The Italians made their own private campaign in Greece. There's the Italian apathy rule in the game, which essentially impacts on the Italians' attacks and when they defend. There's a ±1 modifier, unless they can take Greece on their own without any assistance. And initially I thought, oh, this isn't too difficult, but the terrain is tough, and the British have been able to support with some land-based air, and that was another little interesting puzzle about how to get the air into Athens. Eventually they came in via Crete. So we got some air onto Crete, which gave us the air cover to allow transports to sail into Athens without being threatened by the Italian Air Force. So another nice little plot going on, and so we're now building up towards the big one, which will be Barbarossa. Could happen in the current season. There's at least 1 turn of guaranteed good weather. Someone on Constant was saying they rather favoured attacking in July. You've got three guaranteed good weather turns, and you don't allow the Russians to rebuild after the initial hit. Some units can be replenished, so I think 4 infantry corps that die on Russian soil can come back each monthly turn, but there's no seasonal build, of course. So I think I'm probably going to go with that approach, and we'll see how that does. I've never gone into Russia before with this system, so I'm quite interested to see There was a bit of a debacle for the Royal Navy because we had a turn of very poor weather when there was half range, half movement in the moderate zone, and all air was grounded in the severe zone. And the Kriegsmarine took the opportunity to sail with some large naval assets, including Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Bismarck, to get into the convoy routes, supported by some light cruisers, destroyers, and a couple of heavy cruisers. So the Royal Navy were forced to respond, because it was difficult to search. They had to form multiple groups to give them a chance of finding, and I think that was a mistake because it meant that each small packet was met one at a time, those that were successful, and the losses that the Royal Navy suffered were pretty horrendous. I think they lost a couple of light carriers, a couple of battle cruisers, 1 or 2 battleships, and some other bits and pieces. And although they did actually sink the German light cruiser squadrons and damage a couple of the heavy cruisers, they failed to hit any of the big 3 targets. So in the game you can only interdict the convoys with undamaged naval ships. So essentially Gneisenau, Scharnhorst and Bismarck are still at sea sinking commerce, which is starting to hurt. The only silver lining is that the U-boats haven't been that effective. And we managed to get a fairly big convoy escort ability built up. But I think there's like 9 or 10 U-boats coming back in the summer, so that'll ramp up again for end of 41, going into the happy time, or the second good happy time in 42. So the thing I was testing was using the wartime replacement rule, but just for the aircraft. I'm not using it for any land units. You can build those up from when they're depleted. Anything which has been destroyed can't be replaced. So that is one of the rules which they recommend. So if you lose a chit completely, it's out of the game. But things that are flipped can be rebuilt without the need to have the same units in the force pool. But the air seems to be working out okay at the moment. I mean, there are about 20 chits that are now out of the game completely. That's only going to increase, of course, and I think that will take away a lot of the overhead from running the air game. Whether it still works as a game, is it still balanced? Don't know. The RAF are looking pretty strong. Didn't fight the Battle of Britain. I don't think you can if you're using this system, because you're going to take some losses in France, and then you're hitting the Royal Air Force with a below full strength German Air Force. They've been built back somewhat now, ready for going into Russia, and there's a few fighter wings on the Western Front to attack the Allied strategic bombers, which they've done quite successfully. Will the Germans run out of air power? Just don't know. I think you can only find out by actually playing it. They have the advantage of when they start to lose aircraft over Germany itself, so when they're defending from the bombing or later on in the war, you can replenish aircraft without having to have the reserves in your force pool. So that'll actually help them later on in the war. And of course it'll hurt the Allies because they'll be bombing and they'll be losing air units to both flak and into being intercepted, because when we played it last time there was multiple waves of bombers flying in and really hurting the German economy, and when they took losses you just built them back because it was such an effective strategy. It was just a no-brainer. You know, your B-17s all back at full strength. Any Lancasters that got damaged, get them back. And you had the ability to send in multiple waves. So the most effective thing to do was to send in a wave, escorted. The Germans then had to either put up or shut up. So if they decided to engage, then there'd be trading losses with the fighters. They may get through to the bombers or they might not. But then it meant that the next wave that went in, there was all of the fighters had already been committed. So the only losses you were going to get would be through flak, which could be easily replaced. Now of course that won't happen, because the more times you roll on the bombing table, the more chances there are of flak losses, which all can only be replaced if you've got the spare engines back in reserve. So I think it's sort of maybe 6 one, half a dozen of the other. I'm not sure. I'm hoping I'm going to find out. I mean, there's a bit of work to do doing it solitaire. It's definitely playable, but I think it's the first time I've ever played it, and I think I actually know how this works now. You can see all the various wheels all turning together, which is quite satisfying. I feel quite comfortable with the system. I did a little single sheet of terrain movement costs and the summary of weather effects and terrain, because in most games you get a terrain effects card and it says, you know, this terrain costs infantry X and mechanised units Y, and this is the effect of the of the terrain on the combat. There's nothing like that that comes with the game, so I've actually put together one. If anybody is playing this and they want to get a copy of this, you're very welcome to have a copy. Just I don't know, I guess put a comment somewhere, give me your email and I'll send you. It's just it was done in PowerPoint, which I converted into a PDF. But it's just nice to have a sheet. Summarises all the basics. Save page flipping in the rule book. Right, quick look around the map, and then I think we're good to go. Okay, so that's where we are. Lots more stuff on the map than you saw last time. So we're zooming in around. You can see that the Russians went into the Baltic states and then Bessarabia, and the Germans, there's a lot of hardware now amassing on the eastern border. So they've managed to rebuild most of the air. They've got a few units in reserve which they want to keep for a bit of flexibility. That's what does change with the game, is that you tend to keep a few air units back in your force pool, so you've got the ability to rebuild. So the Romanians and the Bulgarians have just joined along with the Hungarians. That is the Italian army trying to not be apathetic in Greece, and you can see how the Allies are able to support with fighters based out of Athens, which is, I think, critical. Very sorry Africa Corps with Rommel heading to Tripoli with a couple of I forget who it is down there, maybe O'Connor and somebody in that's actually Alpenlik and O'Connor in hot pursuit. So that whole campaign was a bit odd. I think that you need to be a bit wary of what the British are doing, and the Italians maybe needed more support sooner or something, I'm not sure. But a few lessons learnt there. And over here, that task force in that sea zone is the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Bismarck that are currently costing the British 10 economic points every turn, and that's starting to get a bit painful. The convoy escorts are built up sufficiently in that zone. That's the zone where you get the extra die rolls for the happy times. And there's been a few bombing missions. We've got some Stirlings and some Halifaxes and some Whitley bombers which have been hitting. They hit Dusseldorf, which is there last turn, but suffered quite a lot from the flak and from the interceptors. So there you go. So we're at just about to start. We are there, April 1941. It's a mud turn, automatically mud. So I hope that was interesting. If you've got any comments, or say if anyone wants a copy of that play aid, just let me know. Ciao.